They say that until the lion learns how to write, the story will always glorify the hunter, right? I'm somebody who grew up with a lot of idioms, a lot of African proverbs, a lot of advice that surrounded me. But one thing that sort of always stuck with me was something Mekulunkwaipa once said to me. Now, Mekulunkwaipa was my neighbor who sold fat cakes for 20 cents her whole life. Actually, my whole life, ever since I've known her. She's been selling fat cakes for 20 cents. One day, while I was sitting next to her, she said, "Kadona kange, efimbo limumwe nande tongumane kontima we." Now, for the non-Shivambo speakers, it just means sometimes it's best you calm your heart and be still. Now, this advice followed me for most of my childhood, especially coming from a household where silence was very much expected, particularly from girls. Ladies and gentlemen, I grew up in this very same town, Swakopmund. I was raised in a house full of tradition, expectations, and a lot of male cousins. I'm sure I speak for every millennial who grew up in an Ashivambo household, or rather who is an Ashivambo speaker, that in Ashivambo household, there were two rules on top of the traditional expectations that were placed on you. You were not allowed to answer back, but it was also seen as a sign of disrespect if you don't. You were allowed to keep quiet, which was often met with a lot of discipline. Now, for me, this was something that I grew up around and something I carried for the most part of my life, right? But it changed when I got elected as class captain in grade 4 at Swakopmund Primary School. Now, for those of you who do not know the school, it's actually also known as Afrikaans Medium. And at this very same school, I had to speak in front of the grade 4 learners, my fellow grade 4 learners, and tell them why they should choose me as class captain. And surprisingly, I did become class captain, right? And I remember that very same day, I came from school running, very eager to tell Mendikeva. Now, Mendikeva was also a neighbor who sold Otombo and raised a lot of kids in Masilo Street. That's the street I grew up in. And the moment I told her that I became class captain, she was very proud of me. And when she told me that she was very proud of me, it was the very first time that I felt like my voice actually mattered and I could use it, even though not in my household, because my dad was a very traditional Ashivambo man. I think 2 years after that, a volunteer teacher at the Mondesa Youth Opportunities, which is an after-school program that is stationed in Mondesa, gave me a diary. Now, this after-school program offers English, maths, sports. I play tennis my whole life, as well as reading, and most of the times music. When she gave me the diary, I didn't really know what it was because I've never really had something like that before. But she told me, ever since she met me, I've always been sitting in a corner trying to scribble something down. So she told me to write. And when I started writing, I didn't really know what it is that I could write about. So I wrote about what I felt, what it is that I saw in my surroundings, but most importantly, I wrote about the women that raised me and the things that they were going through. To be honest, I'm not somebody that was just solely raised by my dad or my mom. I always had a community of women that surrounded me for some weird reason. When I was in grade 3 at First Konde Primary School, I met Miss Bingham. Miss Bingham was my class teacher who gave me a jersey in front of the whole school for being her best learner then. I didn't know if I was the best learner, but in hindsight, now that I think about it, I think she probably did it because I didn't really have school jerseys or a school uniform by then, which now I'm forever grateful for. When I went to Swakopmund Primary School, I met Miss Ngatumbulange Manga. Lovely lady. She was the very first person to speak a lot of life into me and affirmations. And she was the one person who told me that I belonged where I was, which is obviously a predominantly white school. When I progressed to high school, I met a lot of teachers who also very much took care of me, but all these were just women. I met Miss Moore. Miss Moore always made sure that she brought me lunch every time for 5 years of my high school. I met Frau Scooter. Frau Scooter was a German lady who made sure that I got foster parents to put me throughout school, and they always send me money for Christmas and birthdays. However, I would really like to tell you about the women who saw me every day of my life. These are the women from Masilo Street, surrounding F1576, that is my house number. And some of these women are Mendi Keva, the only lady to date who I think had a lot of sarcasm, and probably only I could understand her. Mehanyanga, unfortunately, patriarchy got the best of it, perpetuated enough, and she died at the hands of a man. Ndito Dino, Ndeutala. These are all the very same women that saw me growing up. However, I would like to tell you about two very particular women that raised me. Mendikeva, obviously being the one. She was a very tall lady. Like when she stands and she speaks, she had a hoarse voice, and she was always very stern and kind, especially when she was reprimanding us. Through her, I early on saw how it is that women roam through the business world that is very much male oriented. But I loved her in particular because she was the very same person who would always tell the kids in our neighborhood that, hey, go to class captain so she teaches you how to read and write. That was my name from her. And I think some of the very same things that I grew up with, you can say that some of my outcomes has always been distant. Now I'm literally just a writer that writes for a living. One thing that I'm forever grateful for Mendikeva is the fact that she never let men, when I was in her presence or in her care, she never let men make gnarly comments towards me, right? If you are Oshiwambo speaking or you grew up, if you're a millennial that is, and you grew up around a lot of Oshiwambo men, they have this tendency of seeing maybe a 9 or 10-year-old and they would say, that is a very common thing. And what that translates to is just to say, you will become my girlfriend or you become my wife. Now, this might seem very harmless, but as you progress through life, the society now knows you as A and B's wife or A and B's girlfriend. They don't really do much, but as this child progresses to teenagehood, these very same men, in a joke, would say, touch the girl's boobs and say, "Tale shwakula." It's a very common thing that unfortunately patriarchy has perpetuated. Societal norms have made it very, very normal. And I'm very appreciative that Mendikeva never allowed the men to do that to me. Now, being raised in a household where there are a lot of male cousins, I've always been surrounded by a lot of women who became my refuge. And in 2006, I met Ndito Dino. Ndito Dino was a very lovely lady from Ukwangaliwa Nyanga, a village deep in Angola where my dad's family is from. And through Ndito Dino, I learned a lot of folklore about the Ovangumbi people, about the very same history of the Awambo people and where they really originated from. But what I'm very grateful for Ndito Dino is the fact that through her, I learned a lot of mannerisms in how to tell stories, because she was very fixated on preserving traditions and keeping the culture alive. And most of the idioms that I use in my performance poetry now are very much things that I learned from her. But what I would like to say is that sometimes when I would sit with these very same women, or when I would write about them, I didn't really know what it is that I could write about. But their experiences often gave me a glimpse into the kind of lives that they lived, even though I was very young to understand it. And two of those experiences are when I would sit with Mendikeva and she's plaiting my hair, and all these women are sitting around her and telling all their issues. One thing I've noticed is that women who grew up our mother's age, particularly, who grew up in these very same test settings, don't necessarily have conversations around their sufferings in full. It's always either in codes or something that only they know how to discuss. And so when they would sit and discuss about their issues, I was always lost. But I'm glad now, because I'm older, I can fully understand. And one particular thing that I remember is that these very same women, their conversations were very brutal, especially when one would ask the other. And in most of these cases, the only difference or the only thing between them would be the silence when the other asks, "Did you rub your wounds with salt and hot water?" Now, if you come from a traditional settings, I very much know that salt and hot water is the remedy for treating wounds. Even if your child fell, that is the one thing that you do. But as I grew older, I realized that these very same women were treating abuse cases, and nobody really spoke about it, because you would see the next day when I would come visit Mendikeva, she's pouring otombo with her right hand or with her left hand, which is not really her dominant hand. So all these very same things are things that everybody in my neighborhood grew up knowing, but never really spoke about, including myself. Obviously, my excuse is that I was young anyways, but now I fully get to write about them, which is the very same choice I made. So From a very young age, writing then became my form of resistance because when I went to high school, my English teacher, Ms. Lowe, she told me that paper is more patient than men. Again, I didn't really understand what that meant. But now that I'm older, I realize that paper gives your writing an avenue to exist without being questioned, without being interrupted. Nobody's going to judge you with whatever it is that you put on paper because anyways, I'm going to put it out, you're going to read it. Maybe you'll have a judgment afterwards, but then it allows room for conversation, understand? And that is one thing I'm particularly proud about. But with my writing being my form of resistance, I realized that my journal was the only place where I could be honest, especially about what it is that I felt, what it is that I saw, and also where I could document the very lives of these very women who didn't really have time or rather an avenue to speak about it, what it is that they were going through. However, when I went to university, I studied English and Applied Linguistics, and then I went on to major in literature, and then I studied communications. Now, doing literature and writing was more for me to understand what writing could do and how I could use it to make the other women's lives better through writing, obviously. But the more I wrote in English, the more I realized that I'm really writing for the wrong audience because the audience I'm trying to tell their story are Oshivambo-speaking women. These women didn't speak English at home. They argued in Oshiwambo, they cried in Oshiwambo. Most of their conversations were in Oshiwambo. And if I wanted to really honor them, I needed to do it in the language that they understood. So my best thing was to return to Oshikwanyama. I'm Oshikwanyama speaking, by the way. And performing in Oshikwanyama has been a game changer for me. And I say this because after my performances, women would come to me and tell me, hey, that is a very relatable story. How come I'm also experiencing this very same thing? Thank you very much for speaking up, even though sometimes it's never really my stories. This was both a good and a bad thing. Good thing in the sense that I'm very glad that women understand that there's somebody who's willing to speak up for them, but also very bad because how is it that women in 2025 are having the same experiences from women from 2007 that I experienced? Somewhere there was a disconnect, somewhere there needs to be a dismantling of certain narratives. And I think the only way to break the cycle is obviously to tell stories in a language that people understand, Oshivambo that is. Now, to further cement my writing journey and to just know that this is the right purpose or right thing that I'm doing, I started writing for the New Era newspaper. Now, writing for the New Era has been a great experience. I've been writing since 2019, and I have a column called Mabutu Conversations. Mabutu is slang for women. It's a slang word that we've used growing up. Now, writing for this very same newspaper was very great in the sense that it allowed me freedom of expression. So I wrote about controversial stuff, entertaining stuff, a lot of educational stuff. And I remember I wrote about virginity being a social construct, I wrote about period poverty, and I wrote about coercion. Something, or rather a conversation that doesn't happen in a Shivambo household a lot. And I would like to argue that some of these conversations don't necessarily happen in these very same spaces because there's no vocabulary for it or language for it. I mean, if you take coercion, for instance, if I were to explain what that means to an Oshivambo speaker who doesn't understand English, I would most likely say otofini nikelenkwe nikongud. Understand, because they don't have a definition to it. But for someone who's English speaking, who doesn't understand what tofini nikelenkwe nikongudi means, it would translate to you're putting somebody between a rock and a hard place. And again, in an intimate space, why would you want to do that? It's not something good to do. My best article by far is titled Condoms in My Purse. And in this very same article, I urged women to carry condoms in their purses. It is something that I still do to date. But obviously, it had a lot of backlash to it because how dare women protect themselves? How dare they actually take charge of their health and know what to do to keep themselves healthy? And what I loved about this article is it was a conversation starter and it helped me be in spaces where people can say, oh, you're the one that wrote that article. I'm like, yes, let's have the conversation. What do you think about it now that you brought it up, you know? And I loved it because it provided me a space to talk to the people who I couldn't really reach. Because I even have people who are in prison who reached out to say, I read your article. Thank you very much for creating awareness around certain topics. Now, for my writing journey, I really, really believe I am a conduit. I believe that I am a bridge between the now world and the world that we are trying to enter. Obviously, the new world that we're trying to enter. This very new world consists of preserving the language in which people are supposed to be telling stories, which can only be done if we tell these very same stories in the language that people understand, right? Like Gogiwa Thiongo said, writing is great, but writing in your mother tongue is even better because it has sort of a sense of reclaiming to it. You are reclaiming back your history, you are reclaiming back your roots. You are talking to people who have a, between you and those people that you're telling the story, there's a sense of familiarity to it. And obviously that makes the conversation easier to have. And through my journey from silence to stage, I've also realized that it was never really about finding my voice. It was always about creating spaces for the voices to exist, especially for the women that raised me. These are the women who endured so much, but spoke so very little. And I am a firm believer that when you tell these very safe stories in the language that they understand, something happens. The silence breaks. It's always like the veil is sort of lifted because now they know, okay, there is a word for this very same thing that happened to me. But when I think about my writing journey and my poetry performance journey, I realize that it requires a lot of passion. It's not something that you just wake up and can do overnight. It requires a lot of passion, a lot of dedication, and understanding and believing that the voiceless around you deserve some dignity for their stories to be told. And when I do write these very same things, I would like to think for yourself when if you would like to be one of the people to tell these stories, because for me I'm just one voice. Even though I carry the stories of a lot of people, I would like somebody to also join me. And obviously it's not something that I'm going to hold against you, but it would be very nice if, because I know there is definitely somewhere somehow there are certain truths that still need to reach the surface, certain stories that still need to be told, right? And when I think about all of these stories that still need to be told, I would like to ask, when we do, what do we think is going to exist in this new world that we are trying to enter? What kind of stories are we going to tell? And if we are going to tell stories, how do you plan on telling these very same stories? Because I definitely know that the new world will still have stories because stories come from experiences, and women will always experience something that shuns them into silence. That's a given. But who then decides to break this silence? Are you part of the people that are going to break the silence? And if you are, then you must definitely consider yourself a storyteller. But being a storyteller, you must sort of have a native language. And obviously, it's not the one you were born into. It's what language do you use to communicate? I'm Oshivambo speaking, Oshkwanyama to be specific, but my native language is writing. And when I couple this with performance poetry, most of the times I've now become a vessel. I've become a medium where most of the stories run through me and they find an avenue where they can coexist. And that is mostly what I want my writing to do for me, to tell the next person that, hey, there is somebody that's willing to tell your story. There is somebody who is not ashamed for your story to exist. But again, I would like to ask, are you that person as well? And if you're going to be that person, what are you going to start with? To be honest, I would like to say start small with what you have, even if it's just somebody's story. Every little experience constitutes to be told or turned into a story. I started with a class captain badge, a diary, and the stories of the very same women that raised me in Masilo Street. And from silence to the stage, that is how I chose to honor them. I was born Frieda Ndeutala Kaunapawa. Yes, my name is a phrase. It translates to, I've seen the world, there's no goodness in it. I might as well tell the stories. Thank you very much.